The morning Cora Atwood rode into Dustfall, Texas with nothing but a letter from the bank and a pistol she barely knew how to fire. She told herself she was not going to cry, and she very nearly managed it. The year was 1883, and the town of Dustfall sat like a weathered coin dropped in the red dust of the Panhandle, surrounded by flat land that stretched so far in every direction that the horizon looked like a promise nobody intended to keep. The main street ran a quarter-mile between the livery stable on the south end and the telegraph office on the north, and everything in between: the general store, the saloon, the barber shop, the small white church baked quietly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Cora was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and possessed of a stubbornness that her late father had always said would either save her life or end it. She was not especially tall, but she carried herself like she was, and her hands were calloused from 3 years of working the Atwood farm without enough help and never enough money. The farm was called Cedar Creek, though there was only one cedar tree left on the property, and the creek had run low 2 summers in a row. Still, it was hers, or it had been until the letter. The letter was from First Territorial Bank of Dustfall, and it informed her, in the precise and bloodless language that bankers favored, that the mortgage on Cedar Creek was 60 days past due. The total outstanding balance, including accrued interest, was $412. If the balance was not settled in full within 30 days of the date of the letter, the bank would exercise its legal right to foreclose on the property and all structures contained therein. $412. It might as well have been $4,000. Cora had $11 and some change in the tin box under her floorboards, and a corn crop that still had 6 weeks to harvest, and a mule who was getting old and slow. She tied her horse to the post outside the bank and stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, staring at the painted letters on the glass. First Territorial Bank. Established 1878. She had gone in there with her father once, when she was 19 and he was still alive, and they were taking out the original loan to buy the east pasture. The banker had shaken her father's hand and not looked at her at all, because she was a woman and therefore irrelevant to the transaction. 5 years later, she walked in alone. The banker's name was Horace Pell. He was a compact man in his 50s with thinning hair and a watch chain, and the sort of politely immovable expression that people who deal in other people's misfortunes eventually develop as a matter of professional survival. He told Cora what she already knew, that she owed $412, that the debt was past due, that the law was clear, and that he was very sorry for her difficulties, but there was nothing the bank could do. "My crop will be ready in 6 weeks, Cora said. If you'll give me the 6 weeks, I can sell it and pay at least half." "Miss Atwood," Pell said carefully, "the policy of this bank is—" "I know the policy," she said. "I'm asking you to make an exception." He did not make an exception. He explained, again with that careful politeness, that the loan was technically in her father's name, and that as the sole inheritor of an estate with outstanding debts, her legal standing was somewhat— He paused to search for the word complicated. He said that the board of directors had already reviewed the account. He said that 30 days was actually quite generous given the circumstances. Cora walked out of the bank into the blinding afternoon sunlight and stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street and thought about what to do next. She had no living relatives closer than a cousin in Missouri she had never met. She had a neighbor, old Walt Briggs, who had his own debts and was 63 and could barely manage his own place. She had friends in town, women she saw at church and the general store, but none of them had $400 to spare. Nobody in Dustfall had $400 to spare. Not really. Not in 1883, when the cattle market had softened and 2 straight dry summers had hit everyone hard. There was one other option, and it had been sitting in the back of her mind since she first read the letter, and she had been ignoring it the way you ignore a splinter you know you are eventually going to have to dig out. Her neighbor to the north, across the creek, or what remained of it, was a man named August Ford. August Ford was 28 years old and had come to Dustfall 3 years ago from somewhere in Missouri, or possibly Kansas. Nobody was entirely sure, and had purchased the old Harrow Ranch outright with cash money, which had caused a good deal of speculation in town, because ranchers who showed up with cash money were either very successful or very much on the run from something. August had turned out to be the former. He was a lean, serious man with dark blonde hair, going a little darker at the temples, and gray-green eyes that had a quality of looking directly at whatever they were looking at, which some people found unsettling, and others found reassuring depending on their own consciences. He ran cattle, about 300 head, and he had 2 ranch hands who had been with him since the beginning, and seemed loyal in the particular unquestioning way of men who are paid fairly and treated with respect. He was not unfriendly, but he was private. He came to church sometimes, and to the saloon sometimes, and he was always courteous in both places. But he did not make easy conversation, and he did not seem to want to be known. Cora knew him the way you know a neighbor in that country, by sight, by reputation, by the occasional exchange of practical words across a fence line or at the general store. She knew he had bought 2 of her father's horses the spring before her father died, and paid a fair price, and had said he was sorry about her father's passing in a way that suggested he meant it. She knew he was not married and showed no particular inclination toward becoming so. She knew that his property bordered her northern fence, and that he had more than enough money to pay off her debt without blinking, and she was going to have to ask him. She did not go to his ranch that day. She went home and fed the animals and made supper and sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the tin box and did her arithmetic 6 different ways and got the same answer every time. Then she made herself a cup of coffee and sat with it until it went cold, and then she went to bed. In the morning she saddled her horse, which was a bay mare named Pepper, and rode north across the dry creek bed and up the gentle slope to the Harrow Ranch, which August had painted and fenced and generally improved until it barely resembled the ruin it had been when he bought it. She rode through the gate and up to the house and tied Pepper to the post and knocked on the front door with a firm and deliberate hand. August opened the door in his work clothes, a canvas shirt and worn trousers and boots already dusty, and he looked at her with those direct gray-green eyes and said, "Miss Atwood." "Mr. Ford," she said, "I need to talk to you about something, if you have a moment." He had a moment. He stepped back and let her in, and she sat at his kitchen table, a good solid table, she noticed, well made, and he poured coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she appreciated, and then he sat across from her and waited. She told him everything. She told him about the letter and the amount and the 30 days and Horace Pell's immovable politeness. She told him about the crop and the $11 in the tin box and the fact that she had no relatives and no other options. She laid it all out plainly, without embellishment, because she was not a woman who ornamented bad news, and then she told him what she was proposing. "I am not asking for charity," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I have thought about this carefully, and what I am proposing is a business arrangement." She paused. "I am proposing that we get married." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside a bird called once and stopped. "Hear me out," she said, because he had not interrupted and she needed to keep moving or she would lose her nerve. "If we are married, the loan comes into both our names under territorial law. You could pay off the bank debt, and I would pay you back from the harvest, and then every subsequent year until the debt between us is cleared. Cedar Creek would remain my property, our property, I suppose, but I would continue to work it and manage it as I always have. In exchange, you would have," she paused because this part was harder, "a wife, which is something most men find useful in practical terms. Cooking, keeping house, that sort of thing. I am very good at both." She stopped. Her coffee cup was in front of her and she had not touched it. August had been looking at the table during the last part. Now he looked up at her. "You are proposing a marriage of convenience," he said. His voice was low and even, not unkind. "Yes," she said. "And you understand that in the territory, once married, your property rights become. I know the law, she said, and there was an edge in it that she had not meant to put there. I know that under current law, a married woman has fewer property rights than an unmarried one. That is why I am also proposing that we put our agreement in writing before the wedding. I have been to see the lawyer in town, Mr. Carver, and he tells me that a written agreement between parties before marriage can be recognized if she stopped. She had been to see Mr. Carver before she had come here. She had done all of this very carefully. August was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Cora watched his hands, which were large and steady and unhurried, the hands of a man who was accustomed to thinking before he acted. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you are the only person in a 50-mile radius with the means to do it," she said. "And because—" she stopped. "Because I believe you are a fair man, I think you would honor an agreement." He looked at her steadily. "And if I say no?" "Then I go back to town and I figure something else out," she said, which was not entirely true, but which she said with enough conviction that it sounded true. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to think about it." "Of course," she said. "I have 28 days left." She rode home and spent the afternoon mending fence on the east pasture and trying not to think about whether he was going to say yes or no. The mending took 3 hours and she did it badly because her mind kept slipping sideways, and by the time she got back to the house, she had redone 2 of the posts and her hands were scraped raw. She had supper and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about her father, who had built Cedar Creek from bare land, and had loved every acre of it with a particular intensity that she had inherited whole. She thought about the cedar tree in the south field, the last one, which was old and gnarled and stubborn, and which she privately regarded as a good omen. She thought about what it would mean to have a stranger in the house, a man she barely knew, sitting across from her at every meal and sleeping in the next room and having by law, if not by agreement, a say in things that had always been entirely hers. She thought about it until she fell asleep. 3 days passed. On the morning of the 4th day, she heard a horse in the yard and looked out the kitchen window and saw August Ford dismounting with that particular unhurried ease he had, as if time was something he was comfortable with. She opened the door before he could knock. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I've thought about it." And she said, "Yes," he said simply, "I'll do it." She let out a breath she had apparently been holding for 4 days. "Come in," she said. "We should talk about the terms." They talked for 2 hours. August was methodical and careful and asked good questions, which she appreciated. He wanted to know about the state of the farm, not skeptically, but practically, as if he was genuinely interested in the details. He asked about the corn crop, how many acres, what she expected to get per bushel at current prices, whether she had a buyer lined up. She answered everything directly. He said he thought her estimates were reasonable and perhaps a little conservative, which surprised her. He knew something about farming, it turned out, more than she had expected from a rancher. They agreed on the terms. He would pay the $412 to the bank. She would pay him back from the harvest and from subsequent seasons, at no interest, which she argued against because she felt interest was only fair, and he said he didn't need her interest money and it wasn't up for discussion. And that was the first small argument they had, and she won the second half of it. He agreed to a nominal interest rate of 3%, and they both seemed slightly surprised by that. They went to see Mr. Carver the following morning and had the premarital agreement drawn up and signed and witnessed. Mr. Carver, who was a small, thin man with reading spectacles and a chronic look of mild anxiety, witnessed the document with the expression of a man who has seen stranger things but is not entirely sure he has. They were married 5 days later by the Reverend Thomas Hale at the White Church on the main street. It was a Tuesday, not a Saturday, because neither of them saw the need to make a production of it. Walt Briggs came as Cora's witness, walking slow but standing straight, and one of August's ranch hands, a compact and capable man named Eli Crane, stood for August. The Reverend read the service in a calm and straightforward manner, and when he got to the part about the ring, August produced a simple gold band from his breast pocket that he must have had made or bought somewhere, because Cora had not known about it, and he put it on her finger with a steadiness that she found, in the moment, unexpectedly moving. Reverend Hale pronounced them husband and wife, and Cora shook Walt's hand and August shook Eli's hand, and they all filed out into the sunshine, and that was that. They went to the bank directly afterward. August paid the $412 in cash, counting it out on Horace Pell's desk with a patience that was not quite theatrical, just careful, and Pell signed the satisfaction of debt papers with his usual bloodless efficiency, and told Miss Atwood, Mrs. Ford, that he hoped things went well for her. August looked at him for a moment and said nothing, and the silence said considerably more than anything he might have put into words. They rode back to Cedar Creek together, and Cora made dinner and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table and ate it, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was enormous. "I put your things in the second bedroom," she said when the meal was half done. "I hope that suits." "It suits," he said. "The room is small but the bed is decent," she said. "My father used it for storage but I cleared it out." "I appreciate it," he said. They finished dinner and Cora washed up and August went out to see to his horse and came back in when the sky was full of stars and the air had cooled to something almost pleasant. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, and he sat in the other chair without asking if she minded, which she thought was good. She would have minded if he had asked, because it would have made the whole thing more awkward than it already was. "I'll need to go back to my place tomorrow," he said. "My hands can manage for a few days, but I shouldn't leave them too long." "Of course," she said. "You don't need to be here. The arrangement doesn't require you to be here all the time." He looked at the stars. "No," he said, "but I thought since we're neighbors I could be useful, if you need help with anything." "I manage fine," she said. "I know you do," he said, without any particular emphasis, just as a fact. "I've watched you manage this place for 3 years." She turned to look at him. The moonlight was honest and clear and showed her his profile, the straight nose and the firm line of his jaw and the way he sat easy in his body, unhurried like a man who has made peace with his own company. "You watched," she said. "We share a fence line," he said. "You can't miss what's on the other side." She turned back to the stars. "What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. "A woman who works harder than 2 men," he said, "and doesn't quit." She didn't say anything. The tea had gone lukewarm, and she drank it anyway. August went back to his ranch the next morning, and Cora went out to the fields. She had corn to tend, and a vegetable garden that needed attention, and the mule's shoes needed checking, and a dozen other things that did not stop happening just because her life had fundamentally changed overnight. She worked until noon and then sat under the cedar tree and ate a biscuit and thought about August Ford. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table, direct and attentive, as if what she was saying mattered. She thought about the gold ring, which was still on her finger, and which she kept being aware of in the periphery of her vision. She thought about the word husband, which her brain kept circling around without quite landing on. He came back 2 days later on a Friday afternoon with a wagon. He had brought supplies, not charity. She saw that immediately practical things, a new axe handle because he had noticed hers was cracked, a bag of flour, a small crate of salt. He set them on the porch and said, "I was making a supply run anyway." "Thank you," she said carefully. "Do you need help with the south fence?" he said. "I saw the wire was down in 2 places when I rode in." She had been meaning to get to that fence for a week. "I was going to do it this weekend," she said. "I have the tools," he said. They fixed the south fence together that afternoon, working side by side without much conversation, and Cora discovered that August was the kind of man who worked quietly but effectively, and did not require praise for doing a job right. When they were done, she was sweaty and her arms ached, and she felt good in the way that physical work well done always made her feel, and she looked over at him and caught him looking at her with an expression she could not immediately identify. He looked away. Fence ought to hold now, he said. Yes, she said, thank you. That night she made a proper supper, pork chops and green beans and cornbread, and they ate it together, and the silence was smaller than it had been the first night. August asked about her family, and she told him about her father, who had come down from Ohio in 1860 and staked his claim and never once regretted it. She told him about the cedar tree and why she felt about it the way she did. He listened with his full attention, which was a quality she was beginning to recognize in him, this way of listening that made you feel whatever you were saying was worth hearing. "What about your family?" she asked, when she had talked long enough that it felt unbalanced. He was quiet for a moment. "My father died when I was 16, he said. Mother passed 2 years later. I had a younger sister, Martha. She married a farmer in Kansas, has 3 children now. I visit when I can." "Are you close with her?" Cora asked. "As close as distance allows," he said. "She writes good letters." "What brought you here?" Cora asked. "To Dustfall." He considered the question in that unhurried way he had. "I'd been working cattle up in Kansas for about 5 years, he said. "I saved enough to buy my own place. I came south because the land was cheaper and the grass was good and I wanted something that was mine." He paused. "Same reason as you, I suppose, just came by it differently." She looked at him across the table. "You paid for yours outright," she said. "You weren't born to yours." "No," he said. "I wasn't, but that doesn't make it matter less." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He stayed the weekend and left Monday morning, and the house felt different after he was gone in a way that she examined carefully and from several angles before deciding she did not know what to make of it. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern. August spent most of his time at his own ranch. He had livestock to manage and hands to oversee and a property that required his presence. But he came to Cedar Creek 2 or 3 times a week, and when he came, he was always useful. He helped with the corn, which was coming in strong in the good sections and thinner than she liked in the areas where the ground was dry. He helped rehang the barn door, which had been warped and stiff since the previous winter. He helped her negotiate with a buyer from Amarillo who came to look at the crop, and she noticed that he never spoke over her or spoke for her. He sat quietly and let her do the negotiating, and only offered a word when she glanced at him for it, which she found she did once or twice without entirely intending to. The Amarillo buyer agreed to take the full harvest at a price that was better than she had expected. He was going to go lower, August said, as they watched the man ride back toward town. "I know," Cora said. "That's why I held out." He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. "I know," he said. "I was going to say good instincts." She was pleased, and then she was a little annoyed at being pleased, and then she decided to just let herself be pleased. In October the corn came in and they harvested it together, August bringing Eli Crane and his other hand, a young man named Thomas Bard who was 19 and red-haired and cheerful, to help. It took 3 full days of hard work, the kind of work that leaves you too tired to talk by evening, and at the end of the 3rd day they sat on the porch, all 5 of them, while the stars came out, and Cora passed around a jar of apple cider she had put up in August, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted because it was the taste of something hard and completed. She sold the harvest to the Amarillo buyer the following week and got her money and paid August $120, which was the first installment toward the $412, and something about the act of paying him made her feel a complicated mixture of relief and a strange reluctance to have the transaction part of their relationship be the thing that mattered between them. August put the money in his pocket and said, "You'll clear the rest by next season." "Maybe sooner," she said. "If I plant the east pasture in wheat as well as corn." He looked at the east pasture thoughtfully. "The soil would support it," he said. "What would you need to do it?" "Better seed than I've been buying," she said. "And another hand for planting. Thomas Bard is a good worker. Do you think he'd work for me part-time during planting and harvest?" "Ask him," August said. "I think he would. He's got the energy of a man who wants to be busy." She asked Thomas the following week, and Thomas said yes with a promptness that suggested he was indeed a man who wanted to be busy. And she paid him a fair day wage and felt like things were beginning, genuinely and concretely, to move forward. In November, the weather turned, and the first blue northers came rolling down across the panhandle, with a ferocity that reminded everyone that this country was beautiful and also indifferent to human comfort. The temperature could drop 30 degrees in an hour when a norther came through, and the wind was constant and mean. And Cora spent those weeks making sure the animals were sheltered, and the firewood was stacked high enough, and the house was sealed against drafts. August stayed at Cedar Creek during the worst of the first norther, because the roads back to his ranch were dangerous in that wind, and there was no sense in risking it. He slept in the second bedroom and was up before dawn to tend the fire, and by the time Cora came out of her room he had coffee made, and she stood in the kitchen doorway in the thin early morning light and looked at him standing at the stove and thought something she immediately told herself not to. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Fire was going out," he said. "I was awake." She sat down at the table and wrapped her hands around the cup he had already poured and said nothing. And the wind screamed outside the windows and the house held, and she was aware in a way she could not dismiss that she was glad he was there. They talked more during those storm-bound days than they had talked in all the weeks before. August told her about working the cattle drives up from Texas into Kansas when he was young, the long dusty months on the trail, and the loneliness that you either made peace with or went a little crazy with, and the friendships that formed out there that were unlike any other kind of friendship, forged in hard conditions and total dependence on each other. He had seen a man die of a snake bite once, out on the Kisham Trail, 3 days from anywhere, and had sat with him through the last night, and he talked about that quietly and without drama, just as something that had happened and stayed with him. Cora told him about her mother, who had died when Cora was 11 of a fever that took her in 4 days, and about how that loss had reconfigured everything, had made her father quieter and made her more self-reliant in ways she did not fully understand until she was older. She told him about the summer she was 17 when she had ridden the boundary of the whole farm herself and mapped it by hand, just to know it, every acre, every rise and draw, and she still had the map in a drawer somewhere. "Show me," he said. She found the map, a hand-drawn thing on good thick paper, and spread it on the table, and he bent over it and asked about each feature she had marked, genuinely curious, and she found herself explaining the land she loved to someone who seemed to understand why land could be loved, and it was one of the better conversations she had ever had. That night the wind died down a little, and the temperature rose enough to be bearable, and they sat by the fire after supper and August read. He had brought a book with him from his saddlebag, a worn copy of something by Dickens, which surprised her, and she darned a pair of stockings, and the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so strange at once that she kept having to look at him sideways to remind herself of what this actually was. She caught him watching her once just for a moment over the edge of his book. He looked back down immediately. She pushed her needle through the wool and said very carefully, "August." "Yes," he said. "This is—" She stopped. "I want to ask you something." He put the book down. "Ask," he said. "Are you content with how things are?" She was watching her hands, not him, with the arrangement. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she looked up. He was looking at the fire. His expression was the one she could not always read, serious and inward, and she waited. "It's not what I expected," he said finally. "No," she said. "Me neither." He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that she felt in her chest, a warm pressure, like a door being tried from the other side. "I think it may be better than what I expected," he said. His voice was very even. She looked back at her darning. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I think so too." He picked up his book and she continued her darning, and the fire burned steadily, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the room felt different after, and they both knew it. December came in cold and bright and dry, and Cora went to the Christmas service at the white church with August beside her, which was the first time they had appeared formally together in town as a married couple, and she was aware of the looks, not unkind looks, mostly curious ones, and a few warm ones from women who knew her and were glad she had found some footing. Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the general store with her husband, pressed Cora's hands and said she was glad to see her looking well, and Cora said she was well and found she meant it. After the service, walking back to where they had tied the horses, August said, "Mrs. Pruitt likes you." "She liked my father," Cora said. The feeling transferred. "I don't think so," August said. "I think she likes you." Cora looked at him. He was wearing his good coat, a dark wool thing, and his hat, and he looked, she noticed for the first time, or acknowledged for the first time, quite handsome in a quiet, unassuming way, the kind of handsome that doesn't announce itself but that you find yourself thinking about afterward. "What?" he said, because she had been looking too long. "Nothing," she said, and untied Pepper and mounted up, and they rode home in the cold Christmas morning air with their breath making clouds in front of them, and she thought about what nothing was increasingly something. At Christmas dinner, which she cooked and he helped with in his quiet, useful way, she gave him a gift. She had been embroidering a handkerchief. She had heard once that it was a traditional gift, and she found the idea of it fitting in a way she could not articulate, and had put his initials on it, AF, in dark thread. She put it on the table beside his plate without ceremony. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "You made this," he said. "Don't make much of it," she said. "It's just practical." He picked it up and turned it in his hands, examining the embroidery with more attention than she felt the object strictly warranted. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close against his chest. He had brought her something too. He went to his saddlebag and came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper and set it in front of her. Inside was a book, a collection of poetry by Emily Bronte, the spine new and the pages clean, and she opened it and read the first poem, and something went very quiet inside her and very clear. "I didn't know what you liked to read," he said, "but Walt Briggs told me you were fond of poetry." She looked up. "You asked Walt what I liked." "I asked if he knew," August said mildly. "He said you were fond of poetry and that you especially liked the wild ones, poets who meant it." She looked down at the book. "She means it," she said. "I thought so," he said. They ate their Christmas dinner, and it was the best meal she could remember in a long time, not because the food was exceptional. The food was good, but it was simple. But because the table felt full in a way that had nothing to do with the food, and she understood now what that feeling was even if she was not quite ready to name it. January in the Texas Panhandle was its own particular kind of hardship. The northers came regularly, the windmills iced up, the cattle drifted and had to be pushed back, and the days were short and gray and cold in a way that tested patience. Cora did her work and August did his, and they fell into an easy rhythm of coming and going, him at the ranch more during the working days, at Cedar Creek more on the evenings when the weather held. She had stopped thinking of it as the arrangement. She was not sure when that had happened. One evening, in late January, she was in the barn doing the evening chores when she heard him ride in. She knew the sound of his horse, which was a big gray gelding named Drum, as well as she knew any sound on her own property now. And she kept working, but felt herself go still and attentive in a way that had nothing to do with the mule she was tending. He came into the barn and hung his hat on the post and started helping without asking, which was what he always did, and they worked side by side in the lantern light, the warm animal smell of the barn around them, the cold wind pressing at the walls outside. She was lifting a heavy feed sack that she had been managing on her own for 3 years, and she got it 2/3 of the way up and her grip slipped, and in one motion August was there, catching the sack from the underside, his hands very close to hers, and they got it into place together. He did not step back immediately. They stood in that small barn-closed space with the lantern throwing warm light and his hand still near hers on the sack, and she looked up at him. His face was very close. His eyes were that particular gray-green that she had come to think of as the color of something rare, like the first color of spring in a dry country. "Cora," he said. His voice was careful and a little rough. "Yes," she said, and she was aware that the word was answering more than her name. He took her face in his hands, those large, steady, unhurried hands, and kissed her. Not a hesitant kiss, not a question, a decision, gentle and sure, the way he did everything. She kissed him back with a wholeness that surprised her, though she thought it probably should not have, and the barn was warm and the wind was outside and his hands were in her hair, and she was aware that this was the best moment she had had in longer than she could easily calculate. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her. He was breathing a little differently. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "for a considerable amount of time." "You have terrible timing," she said, which was not what she had meant to say. "We're in the barn." He looked around at the barn, acknowledging its barrenness. Then he looked back at her with the expression that was almost a smile and said, "Better here than never." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, but it came up out of her warm and real, and she put her hand flat on his chest over his heartbeat and said, "Come inside. I'll make supper." "All right," he said. He had not let go of her other hand. They walked from the barn to the house in the January dark, hand in hand, the stars very bright and close in the cold, clear sky. And she thought about her father and how he had loved this land. And she thought about the cedar tree standing dark against the winter sky. And she thought about the fact that somehow, in the middle of a practical and desperate arrangement, something entirely unplanned and entirely real had taken root and grown in the dry soil of her life. And she was glad of it in a way that went all the way down to the bone. Supper that night was different. They sat at the table and the whole character of the room had shifted, as if light was coming from a different angle. They talked differently, easier and closer, and there were silences that were not absences but presences, warm and full. After supper she sat close to him by the fire instead of in the other chair, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the fire burned and the wind pressed the windows, and she thought, "This is mine. This specific, particular, unplanned thing, this is mine." February came, and with it the question that had been circling without either of them naming it. Cora sat down at the kitchen table one Sunday morning with her coffee and said, "August, we should talk about how this works." He sat down across from her and said, "All right." "We started as an arrangement," she said, "and it is not an arrangement anymore, and I think we both know that." She looked at her coffee. "But I need to understand, what do you want? What does this look like going forward? Because my property, my land, that doesn't change. Cedar Creek is mine." "Yes," he said. "And I'm not the kind of woman who disappears into someone else's life," she said. "I have my own plans, my own work, my own self. That doesn't change with a feeling." "I know," he said. His voice was even and direct as always. "Cora, I did not fall for you in spite of those things. I fell for you because of them." He paused. "I watched you for 3 years before I ever had a real conversation with you. I saw a woman who worked her land and refused to quit and knew what she wanted. That's not a problem for me. That's the whole point." She looked at him. "Then what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want this to be real," he said. "I want to be your husband, not an arrangement, not a business partner, your husband." He held her gaze. "If that's something you want." The room was very still. "I want that," she said. It was the simplest thing she had said in months and also the most honest, and the space between the words and the silence after them was the clearest thing she had felt since the morning she had ridden into Dustfall with nothing but a letter and a pistol, and a stubborn refusal to lose what her father had built. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held on to it, and that was that. Spring came to Cedar Creek like a reprieve. The creek ran higher than it had in 2 years, fed by a wet winter in the mountains to the northwest, and the land was green in a way that this country is green only sometimes, when the conditions align just right. And Cora walked the east pasture with August in late March, and the sky was the impossible blue of the panhandle spring, and the wind was warm, and she felt as happy as she had ever been, which was the kind of happiness that feels like something you should be careful with. They planted the east pasture in wheat, Cora and Thomas Bard working 3 full days while August was at his ranch, managing a tricky situation with one of his bulls and a fencing dispute with a neighbor to his east named Clancy, who was an irascible man in his 50s with a different view of where exactly the property line ran. The fencing dispute occupied August for 2 weeks and involved a ride out to the county seat at Tascosa to look at original survey records and a tense afternoon conversation with Clancy that August handled with a patience she admired. And in the end, the survey records confirmed August's position and Clancy backed down grumpily, and the fence was moved 2 yards east where it properly belonged. "You didn't lose your temper," Cora said when he told her about it. "No," August said. "Didn't want to," she said. "Wanted to," he said. "Didn't." She looked at him with something warm and amused. "What would you have said if you had?" He considered this. "Several things," he said. "None of them charitable." She laughed and he almost smiled, and she thought, not for the first time, that the smile that was always almost there was one of her favorite things about him. In April, Walt Briggs fell ill. It was his heart, the doctor said, a man named Dr. Harmon who came out from Tascosa twice a month and kept a small office above the dry goods store in Dustfall on Thursdays. Walt was 63 and had been slowing down for a year, and the illness came on him suddenly and laid him flat for 2 weeks, during which Cora went to his place every other day to bring food and make sure his animals were fed. August took Thomas Bard and went over twice to do the heavier work, mending a section of roof that had come loose and seeing to the cattle Walt kept, which were only 8 head but were his whole income. Walt recovered slowly and sat on his porch one afternoon in late April when Cora brought him a pot of soup and some bread, and he looked at her with his old knowing eyes and said, "You seem happy." "I'm getting there," she said. "That Ford is a good man," Walt said. "I wasn't sure at first. He was too quiet." "He's still too quiet," she said. "But a good kind of quiet," Walt said. "Yes," she said, "a good kind." Walt accepted his soup and said, "Your father would have liked him. He'd have pretended not to because he'd have wanted to hold it over you a while, but he'd have liked him." Cora smiled. "I know," she said. "That sounds exactly right." May brought a series of small gifts, 3 straight weeks of good weather, a litter of kittens in the barn from a gray cat who had showed up uninvited the previous fall and stayed, and a letter from August's sister Martha in Kansas congratulating them on their marriage, which August had written to tell her about, a little belatedly. Martha's letter was warm and funny and asked very specific questions about Cora, what she was like, what she enjoyed, whether she was good to August, this last phrased as "I hope she is as good to you as you deserve," and Cora read it at the kitchen table while August watched her with an expression she was learning to read, which was a kind of quiet hopefulness. "She sounds like she has your eyes," Cora said. "My eyes," he said, confused. "Not literally. The quality of them, the way of looking at things." He thought about this. "I think she is smarter than me," he said, "always has been." "She asks if I am good to you," Cora said. "Yes," August said. "Are you going to tell her?" "I was going to let you write back," he said. "If you wanted." She wrote back that same evening, a long letter full of details about Cedar Creek and the wheat in the east pasture and the gray cat, and the fact that August had fixed her barn door in October, and she had not told him how much that had mattered, and then she said, "I think your brother is one of the finest people I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and I intend to spend a great many years making sure he knows it. I hope we can meet someday soon." She let August read it before she sealed it, which was an intimacy she did not examine too closely. He read it sitting at the kitchen table, and when he finished, he looked up at her with an expression that was so unguarded that she felt the warmth of it all the way across the room. He did not say anything. He simply held out his hand, and she crossed the kitchen and took it, and he held her hand for a long moment before she went to seal the envelope. Summer came on hot, and the wheat in the east pasture grew thick and strong, and Cora began to understand that this year was going to be a good year, that Cedar Creek was beginning to turn a corner. She redid her accounts in June and found that if the wheat came in as she expected, She could pay off the remaining $290 of her debt to August by fall, a year ahead of the most optimistic schedule she had originally proposed. She told him this at supper one evening in late June, laying out the numbers carefully. He listened and then said, "You know we don't need to keep, it doesn't matter anymore, the accounting between us. We're married." "The premarital agreement," she started. "Cora," he said, "I am not going to take your farm from you. That was never the point of any of this." "I know," she said, "but it matters to me, to pay what I owe." "It's not about trust, August. It's about," she searched for the word, "integrity. I want to be clear in myself that this land is mine because I earned it, not because someone let me keep it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "All right," he said finally. "Pay what you think is right, but I want you to understand something." "What?" she said. "When Martha's letter asked if you were good to me," he said, "the answer is yes, but that's not the whole of it." He set down his fork and looked at her steadily. "You are the best thing that has happened to me in my life. I want you to know that. Not the farm, not the arrangement, not any part of the practical business of it. You." The kitchen was very quiet. "August Ford," she said after a moment, and her voice was not entirely steady, "you have terrible timing in a different way now. You say things like that and then we have to just go on eating dinner." "We can stop eating dinner," he said. She looked at him across the table, and he was looking at her with those gray-green eyes, direct and certain and warm. And she stood up from her chair and crossed to his side of the table, and he pushed his chair back, and she sat in his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, which it was. And he put his arms around her and she put her head on his shoulder. And outside the summer evening was going gold and orange in the west, and the cedar tree stood dark against the fading sky. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it, and it was completely true and entirely terrifying and also completely easy, in the way that the most important things are easy once you stop resisting them. His arms tightened around her. He said quietly, close to her ear, "I love you, Cora. I loved you before I knew I was going to." They stayed like that while the evening went dark outside and the supper went cold on the table, and neither of them minded at all. The summer of 1884 was long and golden and full of work and full of something else, something she had not planned for and could not have anticipated and would not have traded for any other life. August moved between the two properties as naturally as the seasons moved, spending 3 or 4 days at his ranch, which still needed him, the cattle and the land and Eli and Thomas, and then returning to Cedar Creek with the same easy certainty. And she began to understand that home was not a place for him so much as it was a person, which was what it had become for her. They had their arguments, because two people of strong will sharing a life always do. They argued about the best way to get water to the east pasture, which was a real and practical argument about the positioning of a new pump. And Cora was right about the location, and August was right about the timing. And they reached this conclusion together after an hour of talking it through in the field with their boots muddy and the summer sun honest overhead. They argued about Walt Briggs in July, when it became clear that Walt was not as recovered as he had seemed and could not realistically manage his place through another winter alone. Cora wanted to offer Walt the use of the small extra room at Cedar Creek that was not the second bedroom, a room her father had used as an office, and August said nothing against it, but he was slower to agree than she thought he should be, and she pushed him on it, and he said after a moment that he was not opposed to having Walt. He was thinking about how to suggest it to Walt in a way that did not injure the old man's pride. And she stopped and thought about that and said he was right and thanked him for thinking it through. And the argument ended in a way that made both of them better for having had it. Walt came to stay at Cedar Creek in August, with his few belongings and his stubborn dignity intact, and he took his meals with them and sat on the porch in the evenings and told stories about the early days of the Panhandle settlement with an authority that was living history. And Cora sat and listened and sometimes asked questions, and Walt flourished slowly, a plant given late water. In September, the wheat in the east pasture came in beautifully. Thomas Bard helped with the harvest again, working 3 solid days with an energy that made Cora feel old at 25. And by the end of the third day, they had more wheat than she had budgeted for. And the buyer from Amarillo came and paid a fair price, and she stood in the yard with the money in her hand, and felt the particular clear satisfaction of something difficult done right. She paid August the remaining $290 that same day, counting it out at the kitchen table. He accepted it without fuss, the way he had accepted the first payment, and then he went to the strongbox he kept in the second bedroom, which was still called the second bedroom though it had long since stopped being where he slept, and brought out the premarital agreement they had signed with Mr. Carver. He put it on the kitchen table in front of her. "It's paid," he said. "You should have it." She looked at the paper, at the careful signatures, at Mr. Carver's witness notation in his small, anxious hand. She thought about the morning she had first walked into August's kitchen and laid out her desperate plan and watched him turn his coffee cup in slow circles while he considered it. She folded the paper and held it for a moment. Then she got up and crossed to the fireplace and held the paper over the flame until it caught, and she dropped it into the fire and watched it burn. August watched her. "There," she said. "It's done." "Cora," he said. "The debt is paid," she said. "The paper is gone. What's left is—" She turned to look at him. "Just us." He stood up from the table and came to her, and she stepped into his arms, and they stood in front of the fire while the ash of the paper settled, and she felt the full weight of the year, the fear and the desperation and the careful practical plan and the unexpected thing that had grown inside it, settled gently into the past, where it belonged. October brought a letter from Martha saying she was coming to visit. She was bringing her husband Frank and 2 of her 3 children, the youngest being too small to travel. Cora read the letter twice and then spent 3 days in a flurry of preparation that she would not admit to anyone was flurrying, because she did not want Martha to find the farm wanting. August watched this with a quiet amusement that he was wise enough to keep entirely internal. "She is going to love you," he said, the evening before they were expected. "You cannot know that," Cora said, rearranging the parlor for the second time. "I know it," he said. "She might find me too plain or too direct or—" "Cora," he said. She stopped. "She wrote you a warm letter before she had ever met you. She specifically asked if you were good to me. She is going to love you because you are you and because she loves me, and those 2 things make the rest inevitable." She stood in the middle of the parlor with a cushion in her hands and looked at him. "You sound very sure." "I am very sure," he said. Martha arrived the following afternoon in a hired wagon from Tascosa, and she was everything her letter had suggested, bright-eyed and warm, and with the same quality of direct attention that August had, though in Martha it was coupled with an easy talkativeness that August entirely lacked. She was 25, the same age as Cora, with lighter hair than her brother and a laugh that arrived often and without warning. Her husband Frank was a solid and good-natured man who shook August's hand and looked around at the Panhandle landscape with the expression of a man seeing a foreign country, which in some ways he was. Martha took Cora's hands within 5 minutes of arriving and said, "You are exactly what I hoped," which left Cora without any idea what to say, and so she said, "Come inside, you must be tired," and Martha said, "Tired and starving. Frank barely stopped for lunch," and Frank said, "We stopped for an hour," and Martha said, "I don't count wagon stops," and the 4 of them laughed and went inside, and Cora thought, yes, she understood this family. The visit lasted 5 days and was the most alive Cedar Creek had felt since Cora's father was still in it. Martha and Cora cooked together and talked for hours, really talked, the way women talk when they trust each other, frankly and with humor and without pretense. Martha told Cora things about August's childhood that illuminated him in ways she would be thinking about for months, and Cora told Martha about the farm and her father and the cedar tree, and Martha listened with the particular attention that ran in the family. One afternoon, while August and Frank were out riding the property, Martha sat at the kitchen table with her cup of tea and said, without preamble, "He has never been this happy. I want you to know that. In all the years I have known my brother, which is all of my life, I have never seen him the way he is now." Cora turned from the window. "He hides things well." "He doesn't hide from you," Martha said. "I see that. He looks at you the way some people look at water in a dry country." Cora sat down at the table. "That is a very exact description," she said. "I'm from Kansas," Martha said. "We understand dry." They looked at each other and both smiled, and Cora felt something settle very finally into place. The sense that all of this, the whole complicated and unexpected thing was genuinely, solidly, irreversibly real. When Martha and Frank left, the wagon disappearing north toward Tascosa in the clear October morning, August stood beside Cora in the yard and watched until they were out of sight. Then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the cedar tree stood behind them in the south field, and the sky was the deep unbroken blue of the Panhandle autumn. "Your sister is wonderful," Cora said. "She liked you," he said. "I know," she said. "She told me." "What did she say?" he asked. "Several things," she said. "Some of which I will keep to myself and some of which I will tell you later." He looked down at her. "Later when?" "Much later," she said, and she took his hand and they went inside. November settled over Cedar Creek with a cold, clear steadiness, and the firewood piled high, and the gray cat, whose name Cora had gradually come to think of as simply the cat, settled in front of the fire every evening with queenly permanence. Walt told his stories, and August read his Dickens, and Cora worked on a new map of the property, this one larger and more detailed than the one she had made at 17, incorporating the east pasture and the new pump in the fence lines as they currently stood. One evening in late November, sitting by the fire with the wind pressing outside and the warmth of the house around them, Cora set down her pen and said, "August." He looked up from his book. "I think I might be expecting," she said. The silence was different from other silences. It had a quality of brightness in it. He set the book down. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued over the last year, something new, something that had not existed before this moment. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but I think so. She paused. "I think so." He stood up and came to her and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands, and he looked at her face for a long moment with those gray-green eyes, and she could feel his pulse in his hands, fast for the first time since she had known him. "Cora," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. He stopped. "I did not plan for this, any of it. When I agreed to marry you, I was doing a practical thing, or I told myself I was. And then you changed everything I thought I knew about what I wanted. And now," he stopped again. "I am so glad," he said finally. "I am so profoundly and completely glad." She leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment, his hands warm around hers, the fire steady behind them. "So am I," she said. The following week she went to see Dr. Harmon in Dustfall and came home confirmed. She was, the doctor estimated, about 8 weeks along. The baby, God willing and with no complications, would arrive in late June. Walt responded to the news with a gratitude that was almost paternal, his old eyes going bright, and he said, "This house needed a baby in it," as if the house had been waiting for this specifically. Thomas Bard, told the following week, turned so red with embarrassed happiness that he matched his hair, and congratulated them with a formality that made Cora want to laugh and be fond of him at the same time. Winter was that year the best kind of Panhandle winter, cold enough to be honest but not brutal, the northers short and bearable. Cora felt well through most of it, tired in the early weeks and then surprisingly vigorous, and she kept working the farm at her usual pace, only accepting August's insistence that she not lift the heaviest things and that she rest in the afternoons, which she agreed to more graciously than he had expected because she was, in fact, tired in the afternoons. They talked about the future in the evenings, the practical details of it, where the baby would sleep, what changes the room would need, how to manage the farm's seasonal work around a new person in the house. They talked about names, which was a longer conversation than either of them anticipated, and they each had opinions, and they each held those opinions with good humor and some stubbornness, which was comfortable and familiar territory. January was quiet and good. February was cold and full of light. In March, Eli Crane came to Cedar Creek to tell August that his ranch was having trouble with a section of the cattle herd that had drifted west during a bad night and gotten into rough country. August was gone for 4 days dealing with it, and Cora managed Cedar Creek alone in that time with the same competence she had always managed it, and when he came back dusty and tired and relieved, he found supper on the stove and Walt asleep in his chair and the cat in front of the fire, and Cora at the kitchen table doing the farm accounts, and the whole scene had the quality of a harbor after a long stretch of open sea. "Everything all right here," he said. "Everything is fine," she said. The pump in the east pasture needed some attention, but Thomas came and dealt with it. Walt's cold is improving. The cat caught a mouse. He hung his coat and sat down, and she poured him coffee, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her across the table and said, "I missed you." "You were gone 4 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "I missed you." She smiled at her accounts. "I missed you too," she said. Spring came, and with it the planting, and April was a good month for the Panhandle, warm and with decent rain, and the wheat went in and the corn went in, and the east pasture was green and promising. Cora moved through the spring work with a growing heaviness that was not unpleasant but was constant, and by May she had accepted that certain tasks were better left to others, which was one of the harder acceptances she had made in a year of accepting hard things. August was with her most of May and into June, having made arrangements with Eli to manage the ranch in his absence, and she was glad of it, not because she could not manage, but because she wanted him there, which was a different thing entirely. On the 22nd of June, after a night that was long and hard and present in every sense of the word, with Dr. Harmon and the town's midwife, Mrs. Calloway, in attendance, Cora gave birth to a boy. He was red-faced and loud and had the most emphatic pair of lungs in the county, and he weighed 8 pounds 4 ounces, and he had his father's gray-green eyes, or so August said, though Dr. Harmon said all babies had blue-gray eyes at birth, and it was too early to tell. And August looked at the baby with such certainty that Cora thought he might be right regardless. They named him James Thomas Ford James for Cora's father. Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him, they both felt, and Ford because it was the name he was coming into. Walt held the baby on his 2nd day of life and was very quiet for a long time, just looking at him, and then he said, "James. Good name. Strong name." And that was all, but his face said considerably more. August held his son with the same steadiness he brought to everything, but without any of the usual evenness. His face was unguarded in a way Cora had only seen a handful of times, open and bright and undefended, and she watched him hold the baby and felt a love so complete and particular that it had no adequate language. "He is remarkable," August said. He was not talking to her exactly, just saying it to the room, to the fact of it. "He is," she agreed. "He has your stubbornness." August looked up. "He is 2 days old." "He has your stubbornness," she repeated. August looked back at the baby, who chose this moment to make his feelings about something known in considerable volume, and August said with the slow dawning of a smile, "You may be right." The summer of 1885 passed in the particular way that summers pass when they are also the first summer of a new life, long and full and exhausting and lit from within by something that does not have a name but that you recognize when you are in it. James grew fast and vigorously, which Dr. Harmon said was a very good sign and Walt said was obvious, and by fall he was taking an interest in the world around him with the serious and focused attention of both his parents, which made Cora laugh every time she noticed it. Walt's health held through the summer and into the fall, better than it had been, and Dr. Harmon said whatever Cora was doing for him, the good food and the company and the sense of being useful, was doing more than medicine could have. Walt himself said he intended to see James start school, which was 6 years away, and Cora said she was going to hold him to that. Eli Crane married a woman from Tascosa in September, a dark-haired schoolteacher named Ruth who had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, and Cora liked her immediately, and invited them both to Cedar Creek for a harvest supper that turned into the kind of evening that people in that country remember for years afterward. Food and talk and Walt's stories and Ruth's opinions, and Thomas Bard's cheerful presence, and August's quiet contentment and James asleep in his cradle by the fire, thoroughly indifferent to the celebration around him. After everyone had gone and Walt was in his room and the fire was banked, August and Cora sat on the porch in the September night air that was finally cooling after the long hot summer, and Cora leaned against him and he had his arm around her, and James was asleep inside and the stars were very bright in the dark Texas sky. "August," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember that morning I came to your kitchen and put my terrible plan on your table?" He made a sound that was close to a laugh. "I remember," he said. "Were you going to say no?" she asked. "Were you ever really going to say no?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself I needed to think about it," he said. "But I knew when you rode through my gate, I knew it was going to be yes." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because it was you," he said simply. "I'd been watching you manage that farm for 3 years and telling myself it was just being a good neighbor, being aware of what was happening next door. But when you sat at my table and put the whole thing out there, the money and the farm and the proposition, I thought, this woman is not going to give up. She is not going to let them take what's hers. And I thought, I want to be on the same side as that woman." "A business decision," she said. "The best decision I ever made," he said. She settled back against him and looked at the stars. "It was a terrible plan," she said. "It was a perfect plan," he said. "It was both," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "both." The cedar tree was a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, old and gnarled and stubbornly present, and Cedar Creek ran low and steady in its bed, and the land lay quiet all around them in the warm fall night. And Cora Atwood Ford, she had added the Ford by degrees, not officially but in her own thinking, the way names become true when they fit, felt the full particular weight of her own life, and found it exactly right. By the fall of 1886, Cedar Creek had become something different from what it had been in those desperate early months of 1883. The east pasture produced reliably. The south fields were yielding better corn than the county average, a fact which Cora knew because she had started attending the quarterly meeting of the Dustfall Agricultural Association, initially as one of only 2 women in the room, and then, gradually, as a recognized voice whose opinions on soil management and crop rotation were sought by men who had been farming these panhandle lands for a decade before her. August had expanded his cattle operation modestly, not aggressively, because he was not an aggressive man by nature, but steadily, adding 20 head in the spring and building a new section of barn that Eli and Thomas helped him raise over 3 days in August, during which Cora brought food at noon and worked alongside them in the afternoons, and James toddled around the edge of the work in that determined and heedless way of 1-year-olds, and caused his father considerable low-grade anxiety. Thomas Bard left Dustfall in November of that year. He had been offered a position as foreman on a larger cattle operation up near Amarillo, a significant step up in responsibility and pay, and both Cora and August encouraged him to take it without hesitation. He left with his small saddlebag and his red hair and his cheerful face and a handshake from August and a jar of Cora's preserved peaches that he accepted as if it were money, and they stood in the yard and watched him ride north and felt the particular affectionate sadness of a good person moving on to a good thing. "He will be a fine foreman," August said. "He will," Cora agreed. "He already knows everything we taught him and probably a few things we didn't." Eli and Ruth became a fixed part of the world around Cedar Creek, coming for Sunday dinners that Cora and Ruth cooked together with a productive argumentativeness about technique and seasoning that drove August and Eli to take their coffee outside until things were resolved. Ruth was expecting her own child by year's end, and Cora sat with her through the anxious later months with the frank and practical sympathy of a woman who had been there and knew what to say and what not to say. Ruth's child arrived in January of 1887, another boy, dark-haired like his mother, whom they named Joseph, and the two small boys, James and Joseph, would grow up within riding distance of each other and become the kind of friends that early proximity and similar temperament make inevitable. Walt lasted through that winter. He declined in February slowly but clearly, and Dr. Harmon came out twice and said that his heart was simply tired, which was the medical truth of it. He died in March, in the small office room at Cedar Creek, on a morning when the sun came in low and golden through the window, and the land outside was showing the first tentative green of the panhandle spring. He died with Cora's hand in his, because she had sat with him through the night, and August had sat with her, and when it was over they both sat quiet for a long time in the room that smelled of old paper and the particular dry cleanliness of the very old. And then August said, "He was a good man," and Cora said, "Yes," and that was the right and sufficient thing. They buried Walt in the churchyard at Dustfall beside his wife, who had died long before Cora was born, and Reverend Hale said the service, and the whole town came, because Walt had been there longer than almost anyone, and had the kind of quiet value that some people have, the kind that the world is simply less without. Cora put flowers on the grave every week for the rest of that spring, which was something Walt would have called unnecessary, and something she continued doing regardless. In May she discovered she was expecting again. This time she told August in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening, plainly and without build-up, and his face went through the same transformation as the first time. That new expression, that brightness, and he stood up from the table and came around to her and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth. And she thought, "Here is this man I did not plan for. In this life I did not plan, and every unplanned inch of it is the best thing I have ever had." Their second child was born in late January of 1888, in the same bedroom, with the same doctor and the same midwife, and this time it was a girl. She was quieter than James had been at birth, looking around the room with an expression of patient assessment that made Dr. Harmon laugh and say she was already taking inventory. She had Cora's dark hair and something about the set of her eyes that was entirely her own, and they named her Clara, after no one in particular, just because it was the right name when they looked at her. James met his sister with the serious consideration of a 2.5-year-old presented with something genuinely new. He stood by the cradle and looked at her for a long time and then said, "She is small," and August behind him said, "Yes," and James said, "Was I small?" And August said, "Very small," and James considered this and said, "She will get bigger," and August said, "Yes, she will." And James seemed satisfied with this resolution and went back to his toys. Martha wrote from Kansas that she wept a little when she read the letter announcing Clara, and that she was already planning a second visit, and that Frank was not planning to resist the plan as he knew better. She came in the spring, without Frank this time but with her 3 children, all of whom were old enough to be traveling company and young enough to be delighted by everything. And Cedar Creek in late April with 2 small children and 3 visiting ones was a kind of cheerful chaos that Cora navigated with the same practical competence she brought to everything. And August helped in his quiet way, and Martha helped in her warm, talkative way. And the house felt, for those 2 weeks, like the most inhabited place in the territory. Martha held Clara for long stretches and told Cora that she was a particularly beautiful baby, and Cora said she thought every mother felt that, and Martha said, "No, some babies are plain, this one is genuinely beautiful," which was so perfectly Martha that Cora laughed until she cried a little. The evening before Martha left, the 2 of them sat on the porch in the warm spring dark while the men were inside with the children, and Martha said, "Tell me how you really are." Cora thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I am happy," she said. "Not in a simple way, in a full way, like the difference between a glass of water and a river. Martha was quiet for a moment. "That is a very good answer," she said. "I learned to describe things from a man who learned from this land," Cora said. Martha smiled in the dark. "He learned from you too," she said. "He just thinks he didn't." Cora leaned her head back and looked at the stars. "We taught each other," she said. "Without meaning to, that is probably the best kind." Martha left in the morning with her children, the wagon raising a small dust cloud down the lane toward the main road, and August and Cora stood in the yard with James between them and Clara on Cora's hip and watched until the dust settled. "She is going to come back," August said. "Every spring, if I have anything to say about it," Cora said. He looked at her sideways. "You always have something to say about it." "I always have something to say," she agreed. He put his arm around her and James grabbed his leg and Clara made her particular sound of assessment, and Cedar Creek lay all around them in the spring morning, the wheat coming in green in the east pasture, the corn just planted in the south fields, the creek running its slow and honest course through the dry country. The cedar tree stood in the south field, old and gnarled and indifferent to everything that had happened around it and would happen around it still, rooted deep in the red panhandle earth, permanent in the way that things that have endured long enough become permanent. Cora looked at it, as she had looked at it all her life, and felt what she had always felt, that it was a good omen, or maybe not an omen at all, just a fact. A thing that had survived everything the country could throw at it and was still here, still green in the right season, still putting its roots down in the difficult and beautiful soil. August followed her gaze. "That tree," he said. "That tree," she agreed. "It was here before everything," he said. "Yes," she said, "and it will be here after." He nodded slowly, looking at it. "Good," he said. She leaned into his side, the baby warm on her hip, the boy small and solid against their legs, and the spring air moved over the panhandle like a hand over water, and the sky above Dustfall, Texas in the year 1888 was the absolute and unrepeatable blue of a country that asked everything of you and gave everything back differently. And Cora Atwood Ford stood in the yard of Cedar Creek and was, in every sense of the word, home. The years after that were full and good and had the texture of a life that has found its proper shape. The farm grew. The cattle operation on August's property expanded under Eli's increasingly capable management, until August trusted Eli with the full running of the ranch on a day-to-day basis, and was freer to be where he wanted to be, which was most often at Cedar Creek. He never sold his ranch and never intended to. It was his, the same way Cedar Creek was Cora's. And the fact that their properties touched across the old dry creek bed was one of those pieces of geography that felt, in retrospect, like intention. James turned 5 and started the one-room school in Dustfall with the combination of eagerness and seriousness that was entirely his parents' child. And Clara at 2 was already demonstrating opinions about everything with a directness that made August look at Cora with an expression that said very clearly, "This is your doing," and Cora looked back with an expression that said, "You are welcome." They had a third child, another boy, born in the spring of 1890, and they named him William, after no one in particular except the feeling that it was a strong and honest name. William was different from the other two from the beginning, louder than Clara and less serious than James, with a gift for finding trouble in rooms that seemed to contain none, and a laugh that arrived so easily and completely that it was impossible not to answer it. Eli and Ruth had 3 children of their own by then, and the 4 families, the Fords, the Cranes, the occasional Briggs family from up the road who had taken over Walt's old place, formed the particular loose community of people who are not quite family, but who are woven into each other's lives by geography and years and shared difficulty and shared good fortune. Reverend Hale, who had married August and Cora in that plain and Tuesday ceremony in 1883, said to August one Sunday after the service, "You know, when I married the 2 of you, I thought it was the oddest thing I'd performed. A practical arrangement that was clear to anyone looking. Yes, August said. And I have married a great many people in my time, Hale said. Some who loved each other with great feeling and some who made sensible arrangements. And I want you to know that there is not a couple in this congregation who are more plainly suited to each other than you and your wife. August considered this. That seems right, he said. It is entirely right, Hale said. Now go and find her, because she is over there listening to Mrs. Prout explain something about pickling, and she has the expression of a woman who needs rescuing. August found Cora, who did not need rescuing from Mrs. Prout but was glad to see him regardless, and they walked home from church on a clear fall Sunday with James walking ahead of them, and Clara on August's shoulders and William in Cora's arms. And the town of Dustfall moved around them in its familiar Sunday way, and the land spread out in all directions under the enormous sky. And Cora thought about the morning 7 years ago when she had ridden into this town with a letter and a pistol, and a stubbornness that her father had always said would either save her life or end it. It had saved her life. Or rather, she had saved her own life, and in doing so had built something that she could not have imagined from the vantage point of that frightened and determined girl tying her horse to the post outside the bank. She had built Cedar Creek into a working, productive farm that was no longer in debt to anyone, and that was recognized in the county as a model of careful management. She had built a partnership with a man who had started as a stranger and a practical solution, and had become the person she trusted most in the world. She had built a family, 3 children, and a memory of Walt and a sister-in-law who wrote long letters and came every spring, and neighbors who were friends and friends who were as good as family. She had built, out of desperation and stubbornness, and one improbable Tuesday morning in a small church on Main Street, a life that was full and real and hers in every sense. August was looking at her. He had a habit of looking at her when he thought she was thinking too hard, which she did sometimes, and the look was not intrusive, just aware, just present. "All right," he said. "Very all right," she said. He shifted Clara on his shoulders, Clara, 3 years old and entirely comfortable at that altitude, and walked beside her down the road toward home. And the sun was warm on the back of Cora's neck, and William was heavy and sweet-smelling in her arms, and James was finding something interesting in the road ahead and calling back about it. And Cedar Creek waited at the end of the road with its fields and its barn and its old cedar tree, and its particular quality of being the place where she had always been going, even when she did not know it. She reached over and took August's free hand, the hand that was not holding Clara's leg, and he held hers without looking over, because he did not need to look to know she was there, and she did not need to look to know the same, and that was the whole of it, and also more than enough. They walked home in the warm fall light, the 5 of them, down the red dust road through the country that had asked everything of them and given everything back, and Cedar Creek opened up before them like a held breath, and the cedar tree stood in the south field exactly where it had always stood, and the sky above the Texas panhandle was clear and deep, and the particular color of something that lasts.